In Plato's writings, there's a character whose name is Hippias, and he's described by Professor Cushman in his book Therapia as somebody who signalized, this is quite a mouthful, he signalized the brimming, sophistic repertoire of diversified knowledges. You got that? He signalized the brimming, sophistic repertoire of diversified knowledges. In other words, like Hippias sent out signals that what you would find in him would be a man chock full of sophistry. That is, from a Platonic point of view, the sophistry of Hippias amounted to a huge bag full of sophisticated knowledge about a great many things. But this was not to be regarded as true wisdom or true knowledge, but rather a kind of a pseudo-wisdom. It's his substitute. He was, therefore, a worldly man. We might call him a success strategist, about whom it was said he was a man who seemed to have it all and to be able to do it all. He was, for instance, a popular politician. He was a multi-talented intellectual. He was well-reputed. He was sophisticated. He was rich. He was famous. He was well-traveled. And what is more, as a fine dresser, he looked fine doing it all. So he looked good in the part. Well, again, from a Platonic point of view, Hippias was therefore sorely lacking. Like he's an empty suit in a finely tailored one, and therefore completely unqualified to teach. For Plato, Hippias is the kind of man who is an impoverished man, an ignorant one. For his worldly attainments are regarded as nothing as compared with the attainment of spiritual wisdom. So Plato had only disdain for those whose habit of mind or whose way of life was a focus on the acquisition of knowledge about a great many things, while skipping past the search for essential or higher things. Like the Platonic perspective, quoting again from Cushman, is that wisdom is remote from the mental state of one who is surfeited with knowledge of many things. The knowledge which encumbers his mind is incredibly numerous, but the content is 57 varieties of odds and ends. Or put another way, no matter how encyclopedic a man's mind or how learned he may be in the sciences, he is not therefore equipped. That's not what equips him to give good counsel. No, the ability to give good counsel, according to Plato, comes only from that human being who is a lover of truth and wisdom, from a person who strives after true being, like this, someone who's on an entirely differing level. What you see in Hippias, therefore, is a success monger. He's not a spiritual teacher. He was, just to spin this out to make it clear, give you a clearer picture, he was what we might call like a how-to-do-it guy. He's a how-to-get-ahead guy. He's a how-to-make-it-in the world kind of guy. He was, in a word, a promoter of how you could do really well at like storing up treasures upon the earth while forgetting to prepare for heaven. He was the sort of guy who, perhaps on stage when he's performing, is smiling all the time. You can't trust people like that. So Plato's critique of Hippias is that he was crammed full of all kinds of specialized external knowledge about this or that, but inwardly an empty sop. He was skilled only at skimming along the surface of things, very smooth, slick, and clever, but ultimately a vacuous, empty messenger. In a phrase, Hippias was brimful of nothing. He was brimful of nothing. Now, in contrast to Hippias, the knowledge specialist, there's another kind of man who through his life, and in particular, say, for example, through his art, through his teaching, or through his friendships, he has the effect of inspiring a desire for spiritual life. So, for example, if you think of a painter who's living this way, he is someone who would paint in such a way that when you view his painting, it would have the effect of catapulting you into newer and greater dimensions of yourself. Or when you meet a friend who is living like this, that person is living in such a way that her existence points to a transcendent dimension. And you find that after spending time with her, that you want to make it a priority in your life to cultivate a daily practice of prayer and of meditation, because she's had that kind of inspiring effect upon you. Her effect is that you're seized with a longing for God. So in Platonic terms, to use the language of Plato, you begin then, because you feel inspired, to recollect yourself, which is the act of recognizing your spiritual nature. And like cultivating that becomes the priority in your life. You begin to make efforts to bring yourself together fully, to gather yourself in the splendor of the recognition that you were more than just a material girl, you're more than a material boy. You understand more than ever that you're not just a body, you're not just a mind, but you're also a soul with spirit shining through. You're all three of these things: mind, body, soul, with spirit shining through. And you understand and recognize, as in Wordsworth's poetry, that we've come into the world not as a blank slate, but we've come into the world with enormous spiritual capacity. As Wordsworth said, our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath had elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar. So not in entire forgetfulness and not an entire nakedness. Again, like not as a blank slate, not in entire forgetfulness do we come, and not in utter nakedness do we come. No, we come trailing clouds of glory and from God, who is our home. So not a blank slate, but someone with enormous spiritual potential, which means, therefore, again, in the words of Wordsworth, that heaven lies about us in our infancy. The light of God is shining through the newborn child. She's more than a little thing. She's more than just a physical or a material being. She's a spiritual being. But then, of course, as the story goes, the child grows up and there's a downward spiral into spiritual forgetfulness, which often gets solidified in late adolescence as, again, using Wordsworth's words, the shades of the prison house, like peer pressure and such, begin to close upon the growing girl or boy. Like the teenager loses or begins to lose his capacity for wonder and for joy, his heart closes and he becomes preoccupied with, say, becoming like a Hippias. Like, I'm going to make it in the world, achieving perhaps this or that success while ignoring his or forgetting about his spiritual nature. Then, as the thing goes on, the child becomes a man who continues to make it his practice and habit to forget that his roots are in the divine, and who imagines that he's the kingpin of his existence. Now, the hope remains that either some crisis or an awakening of spiritual longing will move such a being towards that task of recollection and recognition, that at some point in his life, we hope early in his life, that he'll begin to seek to bring himself together in a response to the divine light. Now, I was at a cocktail party recently, and I saw this dynamic play out during the evening, because my evening began where there was an evident absence of spirit, and then there was the presence of spirit at both ends of the cocktail party. So in the early part of the evening, I experienced a non-conversation and then a real one. Like during the non-conversation, there were two bodies standing in front of me, but as far as I could tell, they were not there, if you know what I mean. They were there, but they weren't there. They were present, but absent. Their presence was an absence. I couldn't find any way to connect with these two. I wanted to, but I failed. I couldn't do it. And if the evening had gone on like that, I would have gone home concluding that I'd had another non-evening, a non-event, that I'd been to yet another empty cocktail party where nothing happened, where nothing was learned, nothing understood, and therefore an entirely unmemorable event. But then, out of nowhere at the cocktail party, an elderly gentleman approached me in a friendly manner. And I was actually astonished by his immediate interest, and there was a vital presence. He had vital presence. But as these things go, at a cocktail party, no sooner had he made his presence felt than someone bolted between us in a burst of joviality, thereby interrupting the conversation that had barely begun. And not wishing just to stand there like a dolt, I politely eased myself away, saying gently to the older gentleman, "There's no social obligation. Like, don't worry about it." And I sort of eased myself out, and I said, I really thought that would be the end of it, But then I was sitting alone later on, and to my surprise, this man approached me again. Well, it was really quite astonishing. The engagement between us was immediate and on so many levels. Now, on one level, he was way beyond me because he had been a mathematics professor for many years, and I can barely add. But on another level, there was between us, what we shared was an evident search for integrity and for spirituality. So in that way, there was quite a congruence between us. And as we talked together, there was this, what I would sometimes have called the magic of inquiry. And when I thought of the conversation later, tears came into my eyes. It was a very meaningful, rich time. There was absolutely no surface talk at all. Now, his wife came up at some point, and she noticed what was going on between us and made the comment right away with her eyes sparkling, "He needs this kind of interaction." And leaving me with the impression, therefore, that he, like me, has been dragged to lots of these sorts of vapid events. And I thought to myself later that perhaps he, like me, has had the experience of entertaining suicidal thoughts at cocktail parties. Well, what I took away from the cocktail party that night was the memory of meeting somebody whose most evident characteristic, the thing that stood out most about him, was that he was animated by streams of living water flowing from within. It was, in short, a memorable encounter and made my evening. I had a good time at the cocktail party, not known to have perhaps ever said such a thing. Well, my new friend, in a phrase, was no Hippias. He was not like Hippias, stuffed with scientific and historical information, ever ready and willing to disgorge his learning in the presence of any group of open-mouthed bystanders. No, he was the opposite of that, and I could feel his humility and indeed his wisdom. I got the sense that my new friend's thinking arose from an awakened essence. And he was therefore like someone who has, as Houston Smith calls, broken out of our cabined condition. Houston thinks we spend most of our life as if confined to a cabin, living one-dimensional existences. So he'd broken out. He was someone who knew that level of soul that Houston Smith describes, that level of soul that is situated behind the senses, which sees through the eyes without being seen, and hears with the ears without being heard, and which lies there deeper than the mind. I think my friend was well acquainted with this sense of soul, with this life-giving dimension. It informed and inspired his life and manner. So I felt, therefore, blessed at the cocktail party to meet not a sophist, like Hippias, brimful of nothing, but rather a wise man, full of spirit.